On the surface, Eric Landry and Celeste Monroe were the picture-perfect couple. Eric, a 32-year-old paramedic, was known for his dedication to saving lives and his unshakable calm under pressure. Celeste, 28, was a vivacious and charismatic woman who worked as a graphic designer. The two had met at a local charity event in Austin, Texas, and their chemistry had been instantaneous. Their friends often gushed about how well-matched they seemed. Celeste brought energy and spontaneity to Eric's life, while Eric grounded her with his quiet strength and dependability. Within months of meeting, the couple moved in together, sharing a cozy apartment in a bustling neighborhood. To everyone who knew them, they appeared to be deeply in love. But Eric began to notice peculiar things about Celeste as their relationship progressed. She was fiercely private about her past and would deflect questions about her family or childhood. When pressed, she would offer vague answers, claiming she grew up in foster care and had no meaningful connections to her biological family. Eric, a man who believed in respecting boundaries, accepted her reticence, chalking it up to painful memories she preferred to leave buried. As the months rolled by, however, small inconsistencies began to pile up. Celeste frequently received calls from unknown numbers, which she would answer only in hushed tones or not at all. Once, Eric came home early and found her poring over stacks of papers, which she hastily shoved into a drawer when he entered the room. She laughed it off, blaming work deadlines, but Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The unease grew more pronounced one evening when Eric discovered an unfamiliar locked box hidden in the back of Celeste's closet. It was an ornate wooden case, the kind that seemed more suited for heirlooms than ordinary belongings. When Eric casually mentioned it, Celeste's reaction was uncharacteristically sharp. "It's nothing important," she snapped, before quickly softening her tone. "Just some old keepsakes from my childhood. I don't like to revisit those memories." Eric let the matter drop, not wanting to upset her further, but his suspicions gnawed at him. He confided in his best friend, Kyle. "It's like she has this whole other life she doesn't want me to know about," Eric admitted over beers at their favorite bar. Kyle, ever the skeptic, shrugged. "Maybe she does. People hide stuff all the time, man. Question is, how much do you really want to know?" Eric wasn't sure how to answer that question. He loved Celeste deeply, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. His concerns escalated when Celeste proposed a weekend getaway to an isolated cabin she claimed was owned by an old friend. The timing felt strange. Eric had just started asking more pointed questions about her past, and now she was whisking him away to a place with no cell service? Still, Eric reasoned that the trip might be what they needed to reconnect. On the drive to the cabin, Celeste seemed unusually cheerful, humming along to the radio and holding Eric's hand as if nothing were amiss. But as they pulled up to the remote property, surrounded by dense woods and miles from the nearest neighbor, Eric couldn't shake the gnawing sense of foreboding. The cabin was charming but eerily quiet, with no signs of recent occupancy. Celeste busied herself unpacking their bags and preparing dinner, her light-hearted demeanor a stark contrast to Eric's growing unease. That night, as they sat by the fire, Celeste reached for a bottle of wine she'd brought along. "To us," she said, raising her glass with a radiant smile. Eric clinked his glass against hers, forcing a smile. "To us," he echoed, though a storm of questions swirled in his mind. Little did Eric know that this weekend would mark the beginning of a series of events that would unravel Celeste's carefully constructed facade, leading to revelations so horrifying that they would culminate in a spree of brutal murders. The first night at the cabin passed uneventfully, though Eric found it hard to sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin as the wind rustled through the trees. Celeste, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, her soft breaths rising and falling steadily beside him. The next morning, while Celeste was out chopping firewood, a task she insisted on doing herself, Eric decided to explore the cabin. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but an instinct told him that something wasn't right. He started in the small living room, rifling through drawers and cupboards, but finding nothing unusual. Then, he noticed a door partially hidden behind a large bookshelf. It was locked, but Eric found a set of keys hanging by the front door and tried them one by one until the lock clicked open. Behind the door was a steep staircase staircase leading to a musty basement. Eric hesitated, a cold chill running down his spine, but curiosity got the better of him. He descended slowly, the steps creaking under his weight. The basement was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. At first glance, it looked like any other storage space, boxes stacked in corners, old furniture covered in sheets. But as Eric's eyes adjusted to the gloom, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. In the center of the room stood a table covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and a large map. Eric stepped closer, his heart pounding. The map was of the local area, and it was marked with dozens of red pins, each accompanied by a name. The photographs were even more chilling. They were candid shots of various people, some smiling, some unaware they were being photographed. At least a dozen of the faces were crossed out with thick red marker. Eric picked up one of the newspaper clippings. The headline read, "Local woman found dead in woods. Foul play suspected." Another article was about a missing person. As he scanned the names, Eric's hands began to shake. These weren't random strangers. He recognized several of them as people Celeste had mentioned in passing. An old co-worker, a former neighbor, even her foster sister. A wave of nausea hit him as the pieces began to click together. Celeste wasn't just secretive about her past. She was actively erasing it. He turned to leave, his mind racing with questions. What was Celeste doing with these people? Was she responsible for their deaths? He needed answers, but he wasn't sure if he could confront her without endangering himself. Before he could make it back upstairs, he heard the floorboards creak above him. Celeste was back. "Eric," her voice called, light and cheerful. "Where are you?" Eric froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no time to put everything back the way it was. He hurried up the stairs and closed the door behind him, locking it as quietly as possible. Celeste appeared in the hallway, wiping her hands on a towel. "There you are," she said with a smile. "I was starting to think you got lost." Eric forced a laugh, hoping his face didn't betray his fear. "Just exploring a bit. This place has a lot of charm." Celeste nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. But as the day went on, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that she knew he had been in the basement. Her demeanor remained friendly, but there was an edge to her tone, a sharpness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. That evening, Eric decided he needed to leave. He didn't know if Celeste was capable of violence, but he wasn't willing to take the risk. He excused himself to the bathroom and texted Kyle, asking him to call in an emergency, so Eric could have an excuse to return to the city. But when Eric returned to the living room, Celeste was waiting for him. She held the locked box from her closet in one hand and a large kitchen knife in the other. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but cold. Eric's throat went dry as he stared at the knife in Celeste's hand. She gestured toward the couch with the box, her expression unreadable. "Sit," she commanded. Eric hesitated but ultimately obeyed, his mind racing with escape plans. Celeste placed the box on the coffee table and sat across from him, the knife resting casually on her lap. "I know you've been snooping," she said, her voice unervingly calm. "You found the basement, didn't you?" Eric's pulse quickened, but he tried to play dumb. "What are you talking about? I was just looking around." Celeste's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Don't lie to me, Eric. You're not very good at it." She opened the box, revealing a collection of items that sent a chill down Eric's spine. IDs, jewelry, and other personal effects that clearly belonged to the people in the photographs. "Who are they?" Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're mistakes," Celeste replied bluntly. "People who got too close to the truth." Eric's mind reeled. "The truth about what?" Celeste leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You want the full story? Fine. I grew up in foster care, just like I told you. But what I didn't say is that every home I went to was worse than the last. Abuse, neglect, cruelty. I endured it all. By the time I was 16, I decided I wasn't going to be anyone's victim anymore." She paused, her eyes glinting with something Eric couldn't quite place. Pride, perhaps, or defiance. The first one was my foster father. He liked to hit me when he drank. One night, I hit back, harder. I made it look like an accident, and no one questioned it. After that, I realized I had a gift, a way to take control of my life, to make sure no one ever hurt me again." Eric felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He had suspected Celeste was hiding something, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. "So you killed them? All those people in the basement?" Celeste shook her head. "Not all of them. Some were collateral damage, people who got in the way. Others, well, let's just say they had it coming." Her nonchalant tone made Eric's stomach churn. "You can't possibly think this is okay," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "Don't be naive, Eric," Celeste snapped. "The world isn't black and white. People hurt each other all the time. Physically, emotionally, financially. I just even the playing field." Eric stood abruptly, his instincts screaming at him to run, but Celeste raised the knife. "Sit down, Eric," she said, her voice icy. "We're not finished." "I'm leaving," Eric said, his voice steadier than he felt. "You need help, Celeste. Professional help." Celeste's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Help? From who? The same system that failed me over and over again? No, Eric. The only person I've ever relied on is myself." The tension in the room was unbearable. Eric weighed his options, searching for a way out without provoking her further. But before he could act, Celeste's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "Excuse me," she said, standing and walking toward the kitchen to take the call. Eric seized the moment. Quietly, he grabbed his keys from the counter and bolted for the door. He had just made it outside when he heard Celeste's voice behind him. "Eric." He turned to see her standing in the doorway, the knife glinting in the moonlight. Without thinking, Eric jumped into his car and started the engine. As he sped down the dirt road, he saw Celeste in the rearview mirror, standing motionless, watching him go. But Eric knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Eric didn't stop driving until he reached the nearest town, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He parked in the lot of a 24-hour diner and stumbled inside, his mind racing. Who could he trust with what he'd just discovered? Would anyone even believe him? He called Kyle, his best friend, hoping for some clarity. "Kyle, you were right," Eric said, his voice trembling. "Celeste, she's dangerous. She's killed people. I saw the evidence. She admitted it." Kyle's response was slow, almost disbelieving. "Eric, you sound crazy. Are you sure this isn't some big misunderstanding?" "It's not," Eric snapped, the frustration in his voice rising. "I barely got out of there alive." Kyle hesitated, then sighed. "Okay, meet me at my place. We'll figure this out together." Eric agreed, but as he hung up, he couldn't shake the feeling that Celeste was already one step ahead of him. He knew her well enough to realize that she wouldn't let him leave without consequences. Eric arrived at Kyle's apartment an hour later, but as he stepped into the dimly lit hallway, something felt off. The door to Kyle's apartment was ajar, and the faint smell of iron hung in the air. "Kyle?" Eric called hesitantly, pushing the door open. His stomach dropped at the sight before him. Kyle was slumped in his chair, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. His lifeless eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, and a single piece of paper was pinned to his chest with a knife. Eric's hands shook as he reached for the note, which read, "Eric, you can't run from me. Come home, and we'll fix this together." He backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. Celeste had killed Kyle. She was sending a message, and it was clear. She wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. Eric bolted from the apartment and drove straight to the police station. But when he explained everything, the photographs, the evidence, and the confession, the officer on duty gave him a skeptical look. "You're saying your girlfriend is a serial killer?" the officer asked, his tone dripping with doubt. "Yes," Eric insisted. "You have to believe me. She's already killed my best friend." The officer sighed, his fingers tapping on the desk. "Look, we'll send someone to check out the cabin and your friend's apartment, but you need to calm down. You're not helping anyone like this." Eric could see he wasn't being taken seriously. He left the station feeling more alone than ever. That night, Eric checked into a motel on the edge of town. He triple-locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares of Celeste and her knife. Around 3 a.m., a noise jolted him awake, a soft scratching at the window. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned toward the sound, his heart pounding. The curtain shifted slightly, and for a split second, he thought he saw a shadow move outside. Grabbing the motel's landline, he dialed 911, his voice shaking as he explained the situation. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints. It was probably just the wind, one officer said dismissively, but Eric knew better. Celeste was toying with him, letting him know she was close. The next morning, Eric decided he couldn't keep running. If the police wouldn't help, he'd have to take matters into his own hands. He returned to the cabin, determined to gather enough evidence to make the authorities believe him. As he stepped inside, the silence was deafening. The house looked untouched, but Eric knew better than to let his guard down. He headed straight for the basement, hoping to retrieve the map and photographs he'd seen before. But when he reached the table, everything was gone. The map, the clippings, the photos. Celeste had cleared it out. Looking for something, Eric spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Celeste stood at the top of the stairs, her expression unreadable. "I knew you'd come back," she said, descending slowly. In her hand was the same knife she'd held the night before. Eric backed away, his hands raised. "Celeste, you don't have to do this. We can end this. Just turn yourself in." She laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "And give up everything I've built? You don't understand, Eric. I'm not the villain here. I'm the survivor." Eric's foot brushed against a loose plank, and he glanced down to see a rusted crowbar half hidden under the table. As Celeste stepped closer, he lunged for it, swinging it wildly. The first blow caught her off guard, knocking the knife from her hand. She screamed in rage, grappling with him as they fought in the confined space. Eric managed to push her back, but she grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby shelf and swung it at his head. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow, and tackled her to the ground. The struggle was brutal and desperate. Finally, Eric managed to pin Celeste, the crowbar pressed against her throat. "Stop," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "You don't have to do this." But Eric had seen too much, lost too much. With tears streaming down his face, he pressed harder until her struggle ceased. Eric sat on the basement floor, his chest heaving as he stared at Celeste's lifeless body. The crowbar slipped from his trembling hands, clattering to the ground. For a moment, the only sound was his ragged breathing, the weight of what he'd done pressing down on him like a boulder. He stumbled outside, his legs barely holding him up, and called 911. This time, his voice was steady as he gave the address and explained everything that had happened. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the early morning mist. Eric was escorted to the patrol car, his hands shaking as he recounted the events to Detective Henry Warren, who had been assigned to the case. Inside the cabin, officers found enough evidence to confirm Celeste's crimes: her collection of stolen items, her journal detailing each victim, and the remnants of the photographs Eric had seen. It was irrefutable proof that Eric had been telling the truth, though he was initially treated as a suspect. The evidence, along with his injuries and the signs of a struggle, painted a clear picture of self-defense. After hours of questioning, Eric was released. In the weeks that followed, Eric struggled to process everything. Celeste's face haunted his dreams, a constant reminder of the woman he had loved, and the monster she had become. Though justice had been served, Eric knew he would carry the scars of that night forever. In the end, he was free, but at a cost he would never forget.